So this is going to be the first winter in Russia, probably ever, where entire regions will be without heating. And it looks like it's going to be one of the coldest winters so far. And that is because of Ukraine's long-range strikes that weren't happening this time last year. So it's absolutely unprecedented. And this matters because of narrative. Putin has controlled the narrative of Russia using state media and propaganda to convince everyone that everything is fine. But people are going to start questioning that when they're in minus 30 degrees weather, when they're freezing cold. And this could be millions of Russians when these strikes continue. And this will happen. And there's no defense to this. There's no way that Russia can stop these swarms and stop this happening. Obviously, Russia's been doing this to Ukraine for the last 4 years. People are used to it. People understand what's happening in Ukraine. But this is the first time for Russians, and narratives matter massively in Russia. So, to talk about this, I sat down with Anne Applebaum, an absolute expert, an incredible person who knows endlessly about how propaganda works, how dictatorships work, how autocracies work, and this is what we spoke about. Does Putin still have control of Russia's story right now, inside and outside Russia, based on what you're seeing?
So inside Russia, it's very hard for me to judge because I'm not there and because the information that you get from Russia is filtered through so many different sources. I mean, the people I know who work on Russia, Russian opposition who are outside the country, do say that the opposition to the war is growing. I mean, of course, nobody speaks about it in public because you can be arrested for doing so. But there's war weariness both among ordinary people, but also in the Russian elite who don't understand why it's gone on so long. Maybe one hint that there's more war weariness than we know about is the number of strange deaths that have started to come back. So there are a number of Russian business people and senior figures who have mysteriously died under strange circumstances, and that probably means they were murdered, and they were probably murdered for speaking out or for having the wrong views about the war. So there's evidence, they say, of war weariness. At the same time, we know there's now this patriotic education that the Russians do in schools, and there's an attempt to do a facade of everything going really well. But of course, the war is not really going well in Russia, and I think many are beginning to perceive it. And I would say another element, of course, is and maybe we can talk about this in a minute more, is the Ukrainian strikes on Russian refineries, which have led to petrol shortages and diesel shortages, gas shortages all over the country. And that has to get through to people. And the evidence, we know that it's getting through to people, is I found an article in Izvestia, which referred to it and said, well, yes, there are some shortages and they're to do with vacations or it's seasonal or something. But the fact that a state-owned newspaper felt that it had to acknowledge that these shortages existed means that people are aware of them. So that people are aware that it's not going well. I mean, outside of Russia, Putin it's not so much that he controls the narrative. I mean, he has groups of people who he influences, I'd say inside almost every European country and inside the US. And the message is that, Ukraine can't win the war and that it's better to give up and that NATO are warmongers. I mean, that's kind of, the propaganda that we find familiar. I mean, that's all still there. So it works on the people on whom it's always worked. But at least right now, it's not the dominant narrative in any major European country or even in the US, where there are members of the Trump administration who are pro-Russian and who are very sympathetic to those narratives, but they also seem to be hedging a bit because it's not adding up to reality. Ukraine is supposed to be losing, but it isn't actually losing. And as I said, the evidence that they're striking refineries, that they are holding the front line, the fact that the city of Pokrovsk, which was supposed to fall a year ago or 9 months ago, still hasn't been conquered, the wear and tear on the Russian economy, and all of that is kind of chipping away at the narrative of Ukraine's going to lose, Ukraine's going to lose. So I wouldn't say everything's terrific and that, the pro-Ukraine or the not pro-Ukraine, but just the narrative of reality is winning everywhere. But I wouldn't say that Putin's arguments are winning either.
If this continues, and since your article, it looks like Russia are now going to start importing gasoline as an emergency measure inside the country. They already stopped exporting domestically to deal with the supply chain chaos. If an empire like Russia were to
begin to fracture, what would you see as fracturing first? Would it be a societal fracture, a political fracture? What would the sort of beginning of the end actually look like in Russia?
Change in Russia very often happens quite fast. When, in 19, 6 months before the Soviet Union broke up, or probably even 3 months before it broke up, nobody thought it would break up. Right before the Russian Revolution, nobody thought there was going to be a revolution. I mean, what you could see a very rapid change in Russia, and that's actually historically how it's often happened, because the state it's both very strong and very fragile. So it's strong in that the Putin himself actually controls so many levers of power, the economic and political and cultural, and he controls the media and so on. But it's also fragile in that there is no succession process, and there is no, not only do we not know what would happen if Putin disappeared tomorrow, whether he died or was injured or whatever, we don't know who would replace him. We also don't know how that person would be chosen. And so there's a kind of inherent fragility. There's no way that criticism can shape the leadership, because they've blocked all, public doesn't have any influence. Even the elite doesn't really have any influence over decision making. There isn't an alternative to Putin that anyone could see. And that means any form of change would probably be quite abrupt and dramatic. So I'm not sure that there is a thing you can point to. I mean, there would be things like the gas shortages, things like high inflation, the growing willingness of some people to protest again. I mean, there had been protests in the past. They are, they've been very, because people are arrested so fast for joining them, they began to die off. I mean, should that reemerge, perhaps in some of the Russian ethnic republics, or perhaps in the Far East, which is where a lot of the gas shortages have been, and where there had been historically protests in the past. That was what Navalny was doing, actually. The last time he was poisoned was he was traveling to Siberia to talk to Alexei Navalny, the dissident who died at the hands of the Russian state. So you might see protests, or you might begin to see objections, but I'm not sure that there is a pattern I can point to. I mean, that's one of the, as I said, that's one of the things that's unique about Russia, is that it looks like it will never change until it does.
How did it feel seeing Firepoint? This is the company that you visited that builds these long-range weapons, that builds these drones. Actually watching them being constructed, and I've traveled across Ukraine and seen similar types of things, but I always have this moment of kind of realization of what Ukraine is really capable of and where they're really going with this, until I actually saw those sparks, the soldering irons. What kind of feeling did you get spending that time there?
So when I first went to Ukraine right after the war began, I went to a lot of drone workshops, and you might remember these too. I mean, it was literally like people making drones with glue, and Scotch tape. I mean, it was very, very primitive, and there were little shops and, I mean, garages and basements, and people were putting stuff together using Chinese drones they bought on the internet. So the evolution from that to what we have now is the equivalent of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, it's like night and day. And so I've been to other factories, and I should say I went to Firepoint because I wanted to see these long-range drones, the ones that are hitting the Russian refinery, and that's what they make. There are a lot of other very good Ukrainian drone companies, and some they make the sea drones, or they make the battlefield drones. So this happens. It is now the scale of the production, the degree to which the production is now in-house. And so this was the person who was showing me around the factory was very emphatic. She showed me the electronics panels that do, some of them do navigation, or they do other things. She said, this is all made in Ukraine. So they don't want to be reliant on American technology or Chinese technology or anybody else's technology. They want to make it there. That's fascinating, because of course that's also new, this kind of drive to be self-sufficient. And the scale of the production, the speed of it, the high-tech elements, the fact that they make everything there it's really impressive. So Firepoint makes now 100 drones a day, and these are big drones. They look like little airplanes. They're not what you think of as a little drone that you buy on Amazon. They're big drones. They make 100 of them a day, and they launch 100 of them a day. So they're, as soon as they are made, they're used. And these are the drones that they can fly, 1,500 kilometers. They can stay in the air for 7 hours. They can carry explosives. Obviously, they travel in groups. I spoke to somebody else, not at the factory, but another person in the Ukrainian military, who told me that they now launch overall. I mean, this is not just Firepoint drones, but drones more broadly. They now launch several dozen strikes on Russia every day, and this is up from, as I said, these little tiny efforts that were made at the beginning of the war. So it's much more sophisticated. It's much broader. There are a lot of different drone units in the military, many different ones in different parts of the country, in different parts of the front line. There are many different factories. And that's another, I think one of the things that's important to explain about the Ukrainian army and defense establishment is that it doesn't work the way it works in the United States or in most European countries. So it's very decentralized and it's very grassroots. And over the years, I kept encountering some kind of strange combinations. I mean, somebody who was a businessman part-time and who was a soldier part-time and who had a drone group part-time, and there are people who have multiple roles and they're not technically they're part of the army, they're connected to the army, or the military rather, but they also do other things. And I think so it's a kind of citizen-led effort that is very different from the way defense industries work. It's not as if there are people in offices who order X number of things and they send off the order and then someone far away fulfills the order after 5 years. I mean, it's also very fast. And so there's a very short feedback loop between you'll know this too, how the drones are behaving or being intercepted on the front line and the factory. So the factory knows every day they launch drones, or there are the teams that they work with launch drones, and every day they have feedback about what went wrong, what went right, and then that feeds immediately into the production process. And so both this decentralized thing, this feedback loop, the close relationship between the front line and the factories are what is making this innovation go so quickly. And I think it's very, very different, again, from the way defense industries have come to work in countries that are mostly at peace, where, it's the very long chains of orders and long production times.
How did it change the way it made you feel about Ukraine and its position right now? From the first time you arrived in 2022 and saw them with glue guns, saw what they were doing, to now deep strikes in Russia, physically seeing that difference, that rapid change. How did it make you feel differently about the confidence of Ukraine and where things are going to go?
So I have always thought that Ukraine was underestimated by its European and American partners, and really by everybody, and obviously by the Russians as well. And I have always been, I wrote a cover story for The Atlantic in 2022, which was partly about this. It was about the decentralized drone industry. It was about the way the army is a grassroots army. And it described all these things as advantages that Ukraine has that are hard to see from the outside. So in that sense, I'm not surprised. I mean, I've seen this from the beginning, and I've seen it develop, and I've written about the sea drones in the past, which are another amazing innovation, and about other, I've written about this process all along. So in that sense, I'm not surprised. I mean, I suppose the scale now is something that just would have been hard to imagine 2 or 3 years ago, and the abilities that they're attaining. I mean, I should say, before, the Russians are also scaling up their abilities, and there is also a technological revolution going on there as the Russians learn how to counter Ukrainian drones. And this is why the tactics keep changing. As somebody said to me, a drone or a piece of equipment that worked in the winter doesn't necessarily work anymore in the summer. And so if you're not constantly changing, you can't keep up. So I guess I should say I'm not surprised, but I'm impressed by the staying power of both of the technical teams and of the soldiers.
Well, and what you were saying about countering it as well, and the Russians would have different jamming systems, they would counter different frequencies, but with these long-range drones and these missiles, I made a video a couple of days ago to say, that Russia's strength throughout its history was its size. It was impossible for the Swedes, Napoleon, for Hitler to get to Moscow because of the climate, the geography. But these drones don't care about, they don't need to stay in barracks. They don't care about mud lines. They don't care about weather. They can bypass all of that. And you can't have air defense systems over a country that stretches 11 time zones. So do you think this could be the first time that Russia won't actually be able to do this back and forth and counter this? Or do you think they might come up with some sort of strategy to stop this
Well,
happening?
I imagine they're working on a strategy right now. I mean, it is certainly true that in this sense, the size of Russia is the disadvantage because they can't have air defense over their several dozen refineries and maybe several hundred objects that are important to the oil industry and the oil export industry because it's just a huge number, and so it's a huge country. I saw the Ukrainians hit some a refinery that's I think it was 1,500 kilometers from the border yesterday. They can't be prepared at every one of their, as I said, dozens of economic objects with the best air defense that that you can imagine. And so in that sense, the scale is working against them. Yes. I mean, will they come up with something? I mean, I'm sure they're going to try. I mean, they will. I mean, the Russians do have a big advantage of scale. The Ukrainians have beat them technologically, but the Russians can outproduce Ukraine in terms of just the amount of stuff they can make. And actually, a Ukrainian friend of mine said, right now the contest is between, which is more important? Is it innovation or is it scale? And he said, we'll see. But there are ways in which the size of the physical scale of Russia is proving to be, at least in this sense, a disadvantage.
How do you think life is inside Russia for most Russians at different levels? Do you think they know what's going on? Are they numb to this? Will they adapt fairly easily? Or do you think there's a silent sort of pressure building? What do you think the feeling would be for the average person in Russia
Again,
watching this
it's
happen?
really, really hard for me to say because there is such poor information. I don't have access to, I don't know. I have a lot of Russian friends and they're all gone. I mean, they're not in Russia. They're outside. And I don't have I could give you anecdotes from this person or that person's friend or somebody's mother or something like that, but I don't have a sense of the whole country. As I said, I know from people who do polling that there is weariness with the war and there are questions arising about why it's going on so long. And the gas shortages will have the impact of, finally affecting a wider range of people. I mean, of course, people near the Ukrainian border have been affected by the war for a long time. But throughout the broader country, this is probably the first time that large numbers of people feel some impact from the war. And so that could create a sense of disillusion or anger or annoyance. Of course, then, as I said, you have the problem of how does that anger then affect the Kremlin? And the answer is it doesn't have to necessarily.
One thing I wanted to touch on is I just got back from Kherson. I was there for nearly 2 weeks and I was interviewing farmers all across the region from Berislav right to the city center because a very, very famous farmer was killed there with a drone named Olesander. And the Russians have started specifically hitting agriculture, $11 billion worth of damage, and especially in Kherson, they're hitting tractors, they're hitting warehouses, and they're doing a scorched earth. They're causing fields to go on fire. And it's pretty underreported, but I wanted to ask you about it because you've written about the Holodomor. You've written about Russia's use of famine as a weapon, as food as a weapon. How much do you see what's happening now in places like Kherson? Today, a pig farm was destroyed in Kharkiv, being repeated and history being repeated in the Kremlin's mind.
It's certainly being repeated in the sense that they know that the economic strength of Ukraine lies in its agriculture. And so what they're doing is trying to hit Ukrainian, what the thing that's strongest and most important about Ukraine. I mean, agriculture and culture. I mean, they may be also, Ukraine is an important exporter of grain and of food to Africa and to other parts of the world. They may be trying to create an impact there. I mean, we saw some of this at the beginning of the war, when the Russians are trying to create allies in Africa and elsewhere in the world by saying, look, this war is creating food shortages in Egypt or wherever. I mean, just taking that as an example, and therefore we should be allowed to win it. So they're trying to create some anger outside of Ukraine as well. But yeah, I mean, I think the Russians have always known. I mean, there's a phrase, "food is a weapon," that you could hear from the Bolsheviks in 1919, and the understanding that food is a weapon, I think, continues.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me. I'll leave a link in the description with your latest article. It was incredible to read. And do you think you'll be coming back to Ukraine anytime soon?
I hope so.
You hope so. Okay. Well, if you do, let me know before, and we should definitely catch up in person.
Thank you so much for watching and for making it to the end of this video. Just one quick favor, if you could hit like and leave a comment, A, because I love reading the comments and feedback, but B, it really helps the algorithm and helps push the video, get more people seeing what is happening in Russia and having these conversations you definitely couldn't have in Russia. But right now I'm working on a brand new documentary about Russia's shadow fleet. So if you're interested in that subject, hit subscribe and look out for future content, and I shall see you next time.